And at one point she turned around, she said, "You're just not asking the right questions. Why don't you just ask me, what do I want to say about this? And I'll just tell you."
Have I ever told the person who was involved in this content what happened to the content?
If you've been doing something for a really long time, doing something different takes a lot of effort.
This moment makes me uncomfortable.
So they would say something awful about what had happened in their life, and there would be in my head, I'd be like, "Let's make a good fundraiser."
Yeah.
It's part of our responsibility to try and unpick that.
It's really easy to just be operating at 100 miles an hour all the time.
I've had people say to me, "Am I redundant now?" No, not at all. You're just part of a bigger team. Let's try this together. Let's try and do something different. It feels very scary for those of us that have done storytelling in a way where you are trying to find people to fit the box you've already decided you need.
I look back on some of the content that I've made and it's just makes me sort of shudder inside.
In Save the Children, we had a 2-hour window to get the first stories out, for example, in a humanitarian crisis. What impact those narratives have, often the unanticipated impacts as well as the anticipated ones.
You have had a huge amount to do with this being part of the conversation.
My job is not to just produce stories. My job is to produce stories in which the people who are experiencing the thing I'm talking about get to make the editorial choices.
And then in today's episode, I have a chat with Jess Crombie. Jess is a ethical storytelling scholar and a content professional who works with the likes of the DEC, UNHCR, Save the Children, WaterAid, Red Cross, all sorts. If you've talked about the term ethical storytelling in your team in the last few years, there's a huge chance that that conversation has been influenced by the work and research that Jess has done. In this episode, Jess explores contributor-centred storytelling and gives us insights into how we can all do a better job at telling stories. So grab a brew. Hope you enjoy the conversation. See you in a bit. Jess, thank you for coming on to Causes.
No problems. Thanks for having me.
So one question that I ask everybody to get started with is, give me a 1-minute intro to you.
So, I've never been very good at doing the 1-minute intro, but I'm going to do my best. So I guess I have what's known as a portfolio career right now, and it's all about ethical storytelling and narrative change. So I work partly at University of the Arts London, where I teach ethics and storytelling to documentary and journalistic and comms and media students. And then when I'm not doing that, I spend time working with a massive range of organisations, from giant UN bodies through to little grassroots organisations. But all of it is around assessing what narratives they're putting out into the world, what impact those narratives have, often the unanticipated impacts as well as the anticipated ones, and how you practically enact storytelling, which is focused on the preferences and choices of the people that are in those stories. I don't know if that was a minute long, but
that was perfect.
Short version.
This can't come from nowhere. So my immediate sort of let's dive into a bit of your sort of sector highlights, because this has to have come from somewhere to be able to talk about this. So what's your sort of journey to here?
Yeah. So I spent my 20s in advertising as a producer of film and photography, and then in my late 20s I went to work for Magnum Photos, which is a big documentary photography agency, and that was sort of like my gateway into, I guess, more social justice type storytelling. And after that I went to work for WaterAid, and that was my first job in the humanitarian sector. And I this probably sounds very annoying to any students or anyone wanting to break into the sector, but I genuinely didn't care about wanting to work in the social justice sector particularly. But I was interested in storytelling about real world issues. And the role at WaterAid, had an amazing boss there. And the role at WaterAid was this incredible time in my life, because I basically just travelled all over the world to all of their programmes, constantly with photographers and filmmakers, documenting and what they were doing and the reasons for their work, and interviewing hundreds and hundreds of people. And it was a bit of a baptism of fire in the best possible way. But also I became quite uncomfortable quite quickly about the fact that I would arrive somewhere as this kind of white British woman with a list of questions that I wanted to ask people and kind of topic ideas which I knew I wanted them to talk about. And then I would interview people, and there was a bit of space for them to decide on the story, but not that much space, really. You know, I mean, this is very typical story production process that I'm describing. This is not unusual. And I became quite uncomfortable with that because the people that I was meeting had opinions that went far beyond just telling me about the fact that they didn't have access to clean water or sanitation. And I didn't really know what to do about that. I just kind of sat with that discomfort for quite a long time, and then went off and did a master's in critical theory because I couldn't quite find the right master's. And so I thought, I'll do one in social philosophy, and that will give me a way into talking about this and thinking about it. And during that master's, I really pulled apart the relationship between myself as the kind of producer of these stories and the subject, for one of a, I don't like that term, but and the subject of the stories and all the different layers and power levels that were coming into that story production process. And yeah, that was when it started getting really serious for me, I suppose. And I don't know if you want me to carry on and tell you a bit more about what happened after that. But yeah, that's kind of how I got into it.
Yeah, I'd love for you to... So with causes, I'm trying to sort of do... I am in the international development world in content, and but a lot of... I've come from the sort of domestic UK charity landscape as well. So sort of, I see this being sort of for both sides of that, those two circles. Can you talk about, like, what were the things that you saw that made you uncomfortable and made this sit with you, and you want to think about, like, how to process this sort of going forward? Were there any sort of specific moments where you were like, this moment makes me uncomfortable?
I don't think there was any specific moment that made me uncomfortable, but there were some specific moments that really made me reframe my thinking about this. So there was a general sort of rolling feeling of, this doesn't feel quite right. I know this is what everyone does, but I don't feel like it's quite right, and I don't quite know why. And then after a couple of years of doing this at after 3 years at WaterAid, I moved to Save the Children. And initially I was the head of film and photography there when I first went to work there. And I stayed there for 10 years in the end and ended up being the director of content globally for Save. But there was a moment where I was in northern Nigeria, and it was a story about malnutrition, and it was really awful. The amount of malnutrition clinics we were in were very, very serious, with children with very severe acute malnutrition. And I was interviewing mothers who were with their children in the clinic and asking them about, where they travelled from and what their experiences were and what they hoped for their child and all the kind of things that you would expect to be asking a mother in that scenario. And there was one mother in particular that I was talking to, and she was kind of getting a bit frustrated with the conversation. And at one point she turned around, she said, "You're just not asking the right questions, Why don't you just ask me, what do I want to say about this? And I'll just tell you." And I was like, brilliant. I was like, okay, great. Like, do that. But it was, and I left, and I thought that mostly because of the power dynamics involved, because I work for a charity which is funding support which these people are receiving, because I'm white, because I'm British, because of all of these layers of power, mostly people don't turn around to me and say that. They just dutifully answer the questions I ask them. But I thought, I wonder how many of them are thinking that. But it just took this woman to say, "You're doing it all wrong." And it made me think, well, how about, why don't I not, instead of going with this list of questions, which, fundraisers and, and advocacy colleagues and, have given me and asked me to ask, and questions I've written myself, why don't I go with a much more open brief that says, I don't know quite who I'm going to talk to, what I'm going to get, but I'm going to find people and ask what they want to say about this, which seemed like such a no-brainer. But as you all know from working in content, the proposition of that was a bit terrifying to everyone, because it leaves a lot of risk, right, in that you're not having an absolutely clearly defined set of deliverables at that point. And luckily I was in this position of being a head of department, so I started kind of trialing it. And the stories we started getting back were really great and really interesting, and often much more honest than the stories we were getting, and much more interesting, right? Because people spoke fully and fluently, because they would just say what they wanted to say. And that led me to start sort of researching what there was in existing in the kind of academic and media space around this kind of process of working. And I just found there was really nothing at all capturing the fact that if you worked in partnership with people to tell their own stories, you got better stories. And so I persuaded Save to let me do a piece of research, which ended up being a piece at the kind of start of my academic career, which was a piece of research called The People in the Pictures, and which I told them would take me 6 months. It was taking 2 years and needing additional funding of people coming in to support and things. Thanks, Save, for bearing with me and for funding it. But it was really for anyone who has ever done a job like we've done, the things we found weren't surprising, but being able to prove that when you worked in partnership with people to tell their stories, you got better stories, was just really brilliant to be able to have that data, there to prove that. But yeah, so there was that moment in Nigeria, which kind of really challenged me. And then there was a second moment, which was just before I undertook The People in the Pictures, where I had the idea of it in my mind, but I didn't quite know how it was going to fall out at that point. And I was not unused to doing academic research too, so I was really making up as I went along. But that was in Zaatari camp in Jordan, where there was a group of teenagers who had come across from Syria and were in the camp in Jordan, and we were interviewing them. I actually wasn't interviewing them personally, one of my team was, and they were showing him they had torture marks on their bodies from being held in Assad's jails and tortured, and they really wanted us to film them and photograph them and take their testimonies and release that material and tell the world what had happened to them. And we wanted to do that too, but we didn't. We were going to anonymize them, so we were trying to take photographs where you couldn't see the faces. Obviously, they're vulnerable children and they're victims of, torture. But one of the things that they asked us to do was download footage and photos from their phones that they said they had taken of the things that they had witnessed. And so we did download them, we took them back, and then we went to Reuters. On the rare occasions that happened, we worked with Reuters, who used to back verify all of the footage and check that it was the right date stamps and locations and all of that kind of thing. And what they found was that the children hadn't filmed this footage themselves. They had actually either downloaded the footage from YouTube or they had filmed another film themselves. And so we still released their stories. We just didn't release that footage that they shared with us. But again, it was this moment which really made me reframe my thinking about storytelling, which was around this idea that I had often encountered, that people would say, oh, these people, these vulnerable people, these affected populations, they can never really give informed consent because they don't understand the purpose of storytelling. They don't understand the media. They don't understand how these stories are going to be shared on social media. And I suppose what that proved to me was that I had always felt that was wrong. And what that proved to me was that was entirely wrong, because what these children were doing was using everything at their disposal to get the story that they knew was true, but they didn't have all the proof for out into the world, because they understood very well the power of communications to affect real life, socio-political, economic situations. And so again, it was this kind of second moment where I thought, right, my job is not to just produce stories. My job is to produce stories in which the people who are experiencing the thing I'm talking about get to make the editorial choices that mean that story is told in the way that they want it told and in the way that they know it best. And so, yeah, these kind of two big, really reframing and shifting moments. And I suppose my career since then has just been trying to enact that in the sector with some success and, and some failures along the way.
Yeah. I mean, that's like, tell me about where you think we are. We're in early 2025. Like, what, from people in the pictures to now, like, what challenges and hurdles have you met? Do you feel like there's progress? I'm also curious that you come at this from an international lens, but whether you've had much to do with domestic charities on ethical storytelling too. I know there's sort of 17 questions there.
I'll start with where we think we are. So, here in January, it's February 2025. We have come a really long way in a really short amount of time. So that's the really great positive headline. When I released the people in the pictures, there was a lot of people who were interested in this, but they tended to be quite nerdy, kind of ethics geeks like myself, who were interested in it. It wasn't a broadly discussed topic. It was very much, there was content people who thought about this, but the broader sector didn't talk about it very much. And now that is absolutely not the case. I give a talk somewhere and lots of people turn up. I run a working group and we have hundreds and hundreds of members because there's so much engagement and curiosity about how to do this, which is just really brilliant to see. I often get asked who's really nailing it in this area, and I don't think there's any one organisation that's kind of the like gold standard right now. I'm in this lovely position where I have this kind of umbrella view across the sector, and I see lots and lots and lots and lots of initiatives happening, which range from the really practical, like, testing consent apps, and working out and understanding that consent is the kind of cornerstone of this good process, and having it as a dialogue that goes on and on and on for years rather than just a form, right through to kind of great big large scale overhauls of entire story production processes to put them in the hands of the affected people that particular organisation are helping. So there's lots and lots of initiatives happening everywhere and lots of funding. I mean, obviously last week was a little apocalyptic for the whole sector with Trump's orders coming out and his dismantling of a lot of the DEI progress and funding for that. So we will see how much of an impact that has. I was feeling a little despondent last week, I'm not going to lie, but I do think that the momentum has built and is continuing to build over the 5 years. What I'd say we were at now is a bit of a sort of plateau moment where we've had this great trajectory where, and I think almost every organisation now has a consent process. They have some kind of ethical storytelling guidelines, however large or small those might be. They have something to guide them these days. But I think what's happening now is that the business as usual storytelling, which has the biggest impact externally, which is mostly the individual giving fundraising materials. They are, to all intents and purposes, they don't look hugely different to how they looked 5 years ago. So we have a lot of shift and good progress in the process side of things, but on the kind of portrayal and representation and those long-term story impact side of things, I think there's still a way to go at the moment.
Do you think that's because IG individual giving leaders will have potentially seen results based on an old school type of storytelling, and they're reluctant there? Like, what do you think? Why do you think that there's a bit of difference?
Yeah, I think the main reason is that the KPIs which are given to fundraising leaders and their teams are entirely related to money and engagement. They don't have KPIs which are also related to story impact above money and engagement. And so UNHCR, who I've been working with for about 2 years, and we're going into our third phase working now, who are very, very interesting in this space. And it's their fundraising innovation department who I'm working with. And what they are determined to do is recognise that stories have an impact beyond just raising money and getting people to take action. they are also there to educate and embed ideas and truths about the world in the minds of the people who engage with those stories. And therefore, it is our responsibility as a sector to recognise that as a measurable impact alongside the other more tangible measurables. So I think it's partly that, but also I have, a huge amount of, I work with fundraisers. Most of my work is with fundraising teams these days. And I recognise the enormous pressures that they're under in an ever more challenging fundraising environment. And I think the lack of data proving that different modes of storytelling also work. I've released a couple of studies which also share fundraising impact, so the actual money raised. And they have been, the amount of interest from fundraising teams is phenomenal. I released some in partnership with the Resource Alliance, and we had 1,200 fundraisers from over 50 countries turn up to listen to the results. I mean, because I think people want to make this change, but they also are under really significant pressures and they don't want to, they can't afford to take huge risks. So I think it's a combination of, and that first one around recognising the impact of stories beyond those more tangible ones, that's the thing that will take a bit of time, because that's a cultural shift, right? That's recognising that we aim to do good as a sector. That's what we're here to do. But sometimes we can simultaneously do harm at the same time, even if inadvertently. And it was really interesting. I was watching the kind of Band-Aid 40 Ferrari last year, just the end of last year. And I was really struck by a lot of people in the sector who were saying, yes, but it raised so much money and lots of good was done with that money. And then lots of people who were personally felt impacted by the narratives that were created by that song and the lyrics of that song, which they called out as racist and inequitable, that those people's points of view were being taken as if they, it's like they weren't valid simultaneously with the fact that the song did good. And I think we need to get to a space where we can recognise that we can do good and harm at the same time. And that's a hard place that's a hard thing to recognise. I've made hundreds and hundreds of fundraising films in my career, and I look back on some of them and I feel really bleak about them. But that recognition, because if you don't recognise that, then you can't really move forward with change. But that culture change, that's the thing I bump up against most as being the most difficult thing to shift, because it also means some internal reflection often as well, which is hard.
Yeah. So let's come on to the sort of looking back on the fundraising videos, because I share some of the thoughts on this for sure. But before that, so in the Resource Alliance work that you've done, for the sort of fundraising leaders out there who, have you got any, even if it's early stage, sort of results around income on when you tell ethical contributor-led stories?
Yes. So I've released 2 studies now, one with AMREF and one in partnership with UNHCR, which are both using this methodology I've been nerdily developing for several years called contributor-centered storytelling. And what it is about working in partnership with affected populations to define the parameters of a story. It's not participatory practice. I have to say this because everyone always goes, is it participatory practice like giving people cameras? No, it's not that. It's about recognizing that you might be an expert fundraiser or communicator, and you're likely to bring in an expert photographer or filmmaker, whether internally or externally. But then you need a third chunk of expertise to come into this process, which is the affected populations who are living the thing you want to talk about. And together you come together and form a team, and then you decide what story you're going to tell and how you're going to tell it. That's essentially it in a nutshell. And what we, with AMREF and with UNHCR, we released 2 fundraising appeals. We split their donor databases 50-50. And AMREF's donor database were in the UK, UNHCR's were in Canada. And we released the 2 fundraising appeals, one made in partnership with contributors, one made by the organisation in their kind of typical house style. And in both instances, the one made by the contributors raised slightly more money. I mean, no, like we're talking hundreds or, small amounts of money, but still a little bit more money than the other one. And in both instances, audiences also really liked it because they felt closer to the cause, right, to the people that they were there to support. And so now what I'm doing is trying to develop that process to be streamlined enough that it doesn't take much more time than the existing story production process. That's the sort of final hurdle. We proved it works. UNHCR are actually about to release their second appeal, and so we'll have that data back at some point this year as well. So we'll have even more data to add into the mix. But now we're streamlining the process. But yeah, it works. And I think what's really interesting is even with audiences who, even with the audience members who didn't prefer it, they didn't not prefer it. So this is and sometimes we're always like looking to be better, right, to grow, but actually recognizing that you can do something that's really ethical, which is the preference of the people in those stories, and audiences, still going to react in the same way. That's a win as far as I'm concerned as well.
Yeah. There's another thing in that, I think, which is if an audience has got used to the house style of an organization, then that first moment where it feels a bit different, like it's probably, like it'd be interesting to do a test around, well, what happens if you do 10 of those and then the audience warm up to it? That's a new house style where, like, I feel like, I don't know, this might offend some organisations who are doing it really well, but it feels like there's an opportunity to have this, an opportunity for everybody in this space for the stream of content that people put out around this kind of thing, like in income generation content, for it to be contributor centered just from here on out. Because if the results showing that they're basically the same / a bit better, like why wouldn't you want to do that from your, like if it was 50-50, then you should choose the contributor centered storytelling because it's the same, but actually small scale results show that it's better anyway. So there's no, what are we, why aren't we doing it?
And I've been working with Shelterbox recently, and we're just working out how to get this information out into the public again. So this will be more data. But they've been doing the same thing with their emails. So with their emails and social media, they have been doing contributor-centered storytelling based on my methodology, and it's really doing well. And they did an acquisition test, which everyone was saying, "Oh, it's all right with retention, or it's all right with existing donors, but what about acquisition?" They did an acquisition test and it smashed all their other previous acquisition tests out the water. I think it's partly that people don't necessarily know all of this data. I'm sort of getting it out there as much as I can, but, it's a big world. There's lots of information out there. But also, if you've been doing something for a really long time, doing something different takes a lot of effort. And, we both know from working in the sector a long time how busy everyone is. And I think sometimes just that the effort to try and change it can feel daunting. But I think when organisations do, and it really, this is a podcast about leadership, but the organisations where senior leaders are behind this, so Shelterbox, UNHCR, AMREF, they have CEOs who are absolutely behind this and saying to their teams, it's cool, like, let's do this. Well, I'll support you to do this. If we have a slight drop in income, that's okay, because we're on a longer term journey into something which is more ethical and more in keeping with what the people we're there to serve actually want. Organisations where it's, a kind of really keen comms manager trying to do it all by themselves, it's really hard for them. You have to have senior leadership on board. It doesn't really work otherwise.
Yeah, let's come back onto sort of advice for senior leaders on creating space for this. But you said something about making hundreds of pieces of content, and some of the sort of making you cringe a bit. I have this all the time, and I wonder if it's for some of us in the sort of content international development kind of space. It's like I wonder if you sort of have to have this journey, this sort of personal journey in the time that we're in. Of I look back on some of the content that I've made, which has worked, and it's just makes me sort of shudder inside around the kind of like it's like, oh, this is great content. I can't wait to use this content, make something, it works. have I ever told the person who was involved in this content what happened to the content? Like, there's all of these old school practices that I feel really guilty about being part of. But I wonder if that, almost the recognition of that, has to be a good thing for progress. But I was wondering if you could talk to me about your thoughts on what you've done wrong on this, and how that has fed into this equation as well.
Yeah, I think it is a bit of a personal journey, and there's sort of, you have some light bulb moments where you suddenly think, oh, maybe what I've been doing maybe the process wasn't quite right. And I suppose I'd say, firstly, just for anyone experiencing that moment, don't be too hard on yourself, because many of us have had that moment, and it's better to recognize that than to not recognize it. What are moments? I mean, I don't really have sort of any one particular horror story, but it's just more a recognition that the process I used to run, especially really early in my career, when I was in my late 20s and just started with WaterAid, was very extractive. My process was really, I was very in control. I had a list of questions. I was very keen to elicit responses that I felt would work for audiences. There were definitely moments where I was interviewing someone, and while I, felt empathy with them, but they would say something awful about what had happened in their life, and there would be in my head, I'd be like, oh, it's going to make a good fundraiser. Yeah. And I don't think I'm unusual in having those feelings, but it definitely, I now look back on that and I think, while recognizing what a good story is or not a good story is as a part of my craft and your craft and lots of people like us, there are also ways to do it where you are more attuned to the preferences and choices of those people in those stories, and more aware of the impact of those stories upon them. So yeah, it's mostly it's not so much the materials I created, although I definitely don't feel great about all of them. I made a lot of DRTV ads over the years that I don't feel good about. But it's more the process that I feel more impacted by, and kind of, I guess, more guilty or a bit ashamed about on a personal level, because the privilege of sitting down opposite someone and asking them about something tough in their life, and them being brave enough to tell you about it, is something not to be taken lightly. And I think I wasn't always as empathetic as I could have been, when in those moments.
Yeah, but
being brutally honest.
No, this is, I mean, it totally resonates with the one thing that, I mean, a few things you said, but yeah, somebody would say something that's from the heart. It's very sensitive. It's and in my sort of editor's mind, I'm thinking about, how do I get from here to here, kind of thing. And it just feels, there are there are many things I look back on as just, but yeah, I think it's progress. In a way, it makes this space so much more interesting for me, because I sort of feel like it's I want to make amends and get better at the process.
I mean, I think it's a bit like being in therapy, right? Where we've ever done therapy, but where it's always like, well, you need to recognize there's a problem in order to fix it. I think that's the process, and so the process that I see a lot of people going through. So often I'm asked to come into an organisation, and I will spend the first, it's usually a few months. I'll spend the first few weeks interviewing people and running kind of scoping group conversations, and they end up being very therapeutic for people, because some people are very aware of these issues and are thinking about this, and some people are really early on in that journey and find the topics of conversation quite confronting. And I've had people being very vulnerable and sometimes quite upset in those conversations, because I think when none of us go into this sector trying to earn lots of money or become famous, or we go into it because we really genuinely want to create social good and have positive impact in the world. And so I think to recognize that you can do that and have done that, but also maybe there's a darker side to what you've done as well, can be very confronting and difficult for people. But everyone I've ever worked with in that way, you know, when you get to that point where you're like, oh wow, okay, it's the two sides to this. The next question is always, right, well, what do we do differently? And it's great. It's a real catalyst for positive action, because there is loads of things you can do. And so my kind of approach always is, you know, sometimes I work with colleagues from the who are more critical, especially from my academic, you know, side of my work, and they'll often say, "Oh, you're too pragmatic in your approach. You're not critical enough." But I am deliberately like that, because I think that it's only by saying to people, let's try this together. Let's try and do something different. We're not going to get it right, but let's keep moving forward, that change happens. I don't think change happens through berating people and making them feel bad. I think change happens through recognition of, you know, of not always getting it right, but really trying to head in the right direction.
Yeah. So for could be content leaders or organizational leaders who are in organizations who traditionally haven't, you know, they've not been big on contributor-led storytelling, ethical storytelling generally, but are keen to, you know, make progress. Where should people start?
I think if people are, if your leaders are not engaged in it, then a really important first port of call is to convene some kind of way of talking to your leaders about it, whether it's, you know, trying to find a slot in SLT meeting and starting to share some of the things other organizations are doing, share some of the data that's out there that proves that when you do this work, it works. That's a really important, that kind of proof of concept. Rather than diving straight into the doing, I think you really need to kind of socialize the proof of concept that this type of work is doable, is happening, and works. So that would be my first action. And then what I always say to all organizations is think about where in your existing portfolio of projects you could do a trial for this way of working. So maybe you don't want to risk one of your big quarterly appeals. That feels too much. So maybe instead you're going to say, all right, over 3 months, we're going to release a series of social media engagement posts, which are contributor-led, and we'll see how those perform, and we'll take those learnings and then we'll move into something which is more data-driven in terms of finance or whatever. But find that, don't try and do something new on top of what you're already doing, because all of us are too busy to do that. Find something you're already doing and do a trial in there. And then be prepared to do this for the long haul. Don't do a 3-month trial and be like, brilliant, that was interesting. We've got a tiny slice of data and off we go. Keep on developing this. And it can be as you're moving along, you know, as you go through your 3-year or 5-year strategy process. If you're already trialing this, you can start building that way of working into your strategic objectives as an organization so that it becomes embedded in your business as usual, because that's ultimately what you're trying to get to. So start small and aim to get to this being part of your business as usual eventually. But that can take a long time. I mean, as one example, when I was at Save the Children, we decided we wanted to make our DRTV more ethically, you know, a higher ethical product, essentially. And myself and my co-director of individual giving fundraising, we put forward a plan, which was all agreed by our wonderful CEO, Tanya Steele, who was a brilliant CEO at the time. Well, still is a brilliant CEO, but was not there anymore.
She's WWF now.
Yeah, she's WWF. Yeah, she's awesome. But yeah, so we put together a plan, Tanya signed it off, and we hoped it would take us a year. And it took us 3 years to get from a DRTV ad, which was essentially just a parade of context-free, brown, nameless children with a white male voiceover saying, oh, this child is suffering, they need your help, you know, get really through to a DRTV ad, which was essentially like a little mini documentary voiced by 2 brothers who were talking about their own experiences. And if you hate DRTV, you probably still hate the second one, you know. But it was a massive shift. But it took us 3 years to get to a point where that film was making as much money and we could retire the original films. But 3 years is not that long if you think about the life of, Save the Children's over 100 years old. If you think about the life of an organisation and how many eyes are seeing those films, and what that gave Save the Children was a huge amount of data and a total shift in their fundraising, which then was able to filter down into some of the lower stakes bits of fundraising that were happening as well. So, yeah, test and learn, but don't give up. Long game.
Well, on this don't give up a bit, I was curious about whether you had any advice for people who were trying this sort of way of working, I guess, for the first time or the first few times, and maybe I'm sort of getting at this relinquishing the way that you've done things and embracing what might be quite a gritty, sort of scrappy process because it's new for everybody involved. How have you gone about, and the people you've worked with gone about, sort of like relinquishing it's not, arguably it's not about the results. It's about the process, and then you think about results. But this sort of relinquishing, just like we were talking about, maybe you're interviewing somebody and you're thinking about how to get it from here to here. Like when you've stepped back from that, and it's not necessarily, the results aren't necessarily what's in your mind, kind of thing. How do you just, can you sort of explain your thinking around stepping back?
So you're right that ultimately this process, or this way of working, or this whole approach really, because it's not just this CCS process that I've created, it's a whole approach. And essentially the approach is about relinquishing power and acknowledging that while you have a role to play in the process of narrative creation, you're not the only person who knows how to do that or how to tell that story, which again, can be unsettling. I've had people say to me, am I redundant now? No, not at all. You're just part of a bigger team. The biggest thing to acknowledge, I suppose, and get your head around, which can take a bit of trialing to happen, is that everyone has a story to tell. And literally anyone you speak to, if you say to them, this is a thing you've experienced, I want to tell other people about it, what do you want other people to hear about this, will tell their story in a phenomenally engaging way. And I think, it's often felt that you have to find good storytellers, we need to go and talk to, I often get asked with my work, did you go to that refugee camp and how did you audition people? Did you meet like 100 people before you worked with those 5 participants? No, we literally, with one of the tests we did, we put a call out and we got all the names and randomly picked 5 people from the names, ensuring there was a gender and age balance. But apart from that, we just randomly picked people and so I suppose it's trusting that if you relinquish that power, because people are living this thing every single day, they are going to say something really interesting about it. But that feels very scary the first time you do it. And the second time, it feels very scary for those of us that have done storytelling in a way where you are trying to find people to fit the box you've already decided you need. To go with a much more open brief feels very scary, but it really works. And it works it works so much better. You get so much more in terms of the quality and emotion, all the things that you want from stories, right? You get so much more of that because people want to tell that story. They want to share what's going on. They volunteered to be a part of that, to be a partner with you in that process. So yeah, it's a little bit of I remember this book from the 1980s when I was a kid called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And I feel like that's basically what I'm saying to people. Like, it's all right, I too feel scared about this, but it works. So do it. And that's a hard sell, I guess.
Yeah. Amazing.
That's the truth.
What does good content leadership look like to you?
Oh, that's a tough question. Well, quite apart from ethical storytelling, good content leadership is letting the people who tell stories well do their, have control over the way stories get told. The organisations I work with where the stories are really compelling and brilliant, it's because the SLT stand back and say, all right, we've got some great story producers here, go for it. UNICEF's a really nice example where they have, this brilliant head of content, Marta Salafon, and She's really empowered by the leadership team who are like, yeah, Marta's great. They check in, but essentially she's left to, and the teams I work with where that happens, that's so important and valuable. Because, the cold, dead hand of millions of pieces of info is the death knell. And any good piece of content, right? You need a bit of ownership over it. I also think, and just sorry to bang on about it, but I think the point that you know your audiences, you know your aims and objectives, but you don't know the situations you're talking about better than the people who are living it. And so for you not to include them properly in the editorial decision-making process is a missed opportunity.
I'm just curious about your sort of work process on making sure that sort of an SLT or too many people don't dilute something. Can you talk about your views on making sure that things aren't diluted in that way?
Yeah. So I haven't talked about it very much, but for 10 years I was the director of content at Save and making fundraising and comms and media content for 27 countries. So there's lots of opinions to manage. I always start, and this is the same now, actually I work as a consultant with organisations, we do the same thing. I just always start off with a very clear list of who gets to input and who doesn't. And crucially, I give each of those people roles and responsibilities. So if you are someone from the safeguarding team, for example, your input area and specialism is around safeguarding, and you can input editorial decisions if you want to, but those do not have to be taken into account by the person who's leading on editorial decisions. And then I'm very strict about that process because, and I think always the proof is in the pudding. If you make consistently good, you have to make really good content, but if you make consistently good content, then the battle for lots of input will get easier and easier because you're able to say, look, we did it in that process. We know what we're doing, and people will back off at that point. And that's been my experience. I'm quite strict though.
Amazing. So one of the things I'm interested in is, I mean, you've worked with the DC, and UNHCR as well. Have lots of the people you've worked with, Save, or WaterAid, everybody. They're involved in humanitarian rapid crises some of the time.
Yeah.
And obviously, as organisations who sort of fundraise on for responses to these humanitarian crises, whatever they are, a lot of that is going to be very, very fast-paced sort of content collection and things like that. What are your thoughts on how do you apply this kind of mindset around contributor-led storytelling and ethical storytelling in a matter of sort of 3 days kind of thing? Yeah. Like if something has to be very quick, do you have thoughts on humanitarian content?
Yes, yeah, I still do a lot of work with rapid onset humanitarian organisations, and so what I've developed and trialled is a tiered process. So at one end, you've got the kind of contributor-centred story production process that I've been talking about, trialling with AMREF and UNHCR, which, when you need about 5 days to work with people in partnership. But at the other end of the process is something where, in Save the Children, we had a 2-hour window to get the first stories out, for example, in a humanitarian crisis. So you're moving very, very fast. And what that end of the process is all about is about really good conversations about the impact of stories and ongoing dialogue. So in the initial moment of story production, you're making sure that you give as much time to having a conversation about who you are and what you're doing and where this might end up. I guess a consent conversation, but a more full one as you are in gathering the story. But then really critically, you ensure that you are able to reach those people afterwards. So a week later, 2 weeks later, you're able to go back to them and say, are you still comfortable with us using a picture? Would you like us to take it down? What's happened in your life since then? And I've worked with organisations who say, and who are sceptical about whether or not that is possible. But I've also worked with big organisations like IRC who do this. And a Comic Relief, for example, Comic Relief don't work in rapid onset, but they go back to all of the people they interview and to always check every time they use the stories again. IRC do work in rapid onset and will ensure this kind of follow-up conversational process that goes on. And it's given that everyone's got WhatsApp and smartphones, most people have these days. It's not that difficult to do. And if you can't do it, then you don't use the story. But in the majority of cases, you can. So they're the kind of two ends. But ultimately, all of this process is about making sure that you're making as much effort as you can to share the responsibility of decision-making about where and how stories are used with the people in those stories. That's the kind of bottom line about it.
Yeah, great. Let's do, so a sort of recurring bit of this is, you brought some objects. The objects represent sort of pivotal moments in your journey. You can take journey to mean whatever you want. What are your 3 objects? Just sort of give us a whistle-stop tour through them. Show them, tell us what they are, what they represent.
Not very interesting objects. 2 of them are books. This is, I have behind me in a cupboard, I have got loads and loads and loads of these. These are when I used to interview people and make written notes as I was interviewing people as well as recording it. And I have tons and tons of these. And what they represent is, I suppose, the thing I was describing earlier, which is my growing recognition that these people I was talking to were not story subjects, but were partners in that process. So I keep these as a reminder of what I used to do and probably shouldn't do anymore, but also, as a kind of reminder of that part of my career. The second one is very boring, but it's the people in the pictures, just because it was such a it was this complete pivotal moment for me, because it was the moment where I realised that I wanted to do something on a larger scale than leading content in an organisation, which was brilliant. I really enjoyed it. Was a wrench to leave. But I wanted to do something which was a bit more sector-wide in terms of trying to create narrative change. And that was the moment where I kind of got the research bug, I suppose, and thought about going into academia.
Were you daunted by that moment? You've been in Save, you were director of stories. To go out on your own is kind of scary. Like, were you ready for that? Were you prepared for the fear?
That brings me to my third item, which these are my youngest child's first shoes. And the reason I've got these, he'd be horrified by that, but the reason I've got those is because it was around that time that I had my second child, and he wasn't very well. And so I was having to spend a lot of time in hospital with him, and he's fine now. So in a way, that decision was sort of taken away from me, because I realised I couldn't travel as much as I had been travelling before, and so I needed a different kind of career. And also because he was unwell, and I think I was probably a bit overworked, I also was signed off work for a month at one point to have a bit of and it was this moment where I just had a bit of a pause in the kind of whirlwind of work and family life, and thought about what I actually really wanted, and realised that what I wanted to do was just fully nerd out about ethical storytelling all the time. And so it was really daunting, but it also felt like it was sort of inescapable, like it was happening, and I didn't really have much choice about it. But I was also helped around that time in that UAL, the university that I still work for, were looking for people around that time. And I happened to and took me on as a very early career academic, and in a very small way at first, and so I was able to have this, academia doesn't pay very well, but I was able to have a bit of a job, to take me through that transition. But yes, it was really daunting, and it continues to be. And when something like Trump's announcements last week happened, it feels very scary to be primarily freelance, and at that time. But I think it's really important. I feel, quite sort of evangelical about it, really, in that I do think that as a sector, we have done all kinds of wonderful things in the world, but we have also created these great big monoliths of public opinion about the locations and people with whom we work and serve. And it's part of our responsibility to try and unpick that and change that, because we have real influence in the world, in terms of the way people think about world events. So yeah, I'm in a very sweet spot in my career right now in having this kind of momentum to do this stuff, but also being able to do it, which is nice. Lucky for me.
I mean, I would say from a sort of somebody who feels very invested in this, but as an observer, I feel like you have had a huge amount to do with this being part of the conversation in the sort of world that I'm operating in terms of organisationally. Like it's a lot of the conversation is based on research that you've been heavily involved in. So I'd say from the sector, thank you very much.
Yeah.
One question I've got though, it kind of resonated immediately, was the month off kind of thing. That I feel like content, comms people, it's really easy to just be operating at 100 miles an hour all the time. What advice do you have for people to, in this work, sort of how can they go about avoiding burnout if they're approaching it?
Yeah. So that period for me was right. I had been working on the Syria crisis and on the European kind of refugee situation in 2015 and 2016 very intensively. And I didn't recognize what was happening. I just was, feeling more tired and irritable than usual, but I also had a full-time job and 2 small children, and I was tired and irritable quite a lot of the time anyway. And then it reached a point where I was just unable to continue to engage with the stories that we were telling, and which made my job impossible because that's all I did all the time. And so, just couldn't be in work at that point. And I think I talk to people now, and there are definitely support structures in place for comms and content people. And there's a recognition of things like secondary PTSD and first PTSD. But that's very new. That definitely wasn't there when, I remember I had 2 people in my team whose job it was to be humanitarian content collectors, and they literally just went from disaster to disaster to disaster all over the world all the time. And I feel really bad about that now when I look back on it, because there wasn't much, support for them emotionally. So I suppose it's just recognizing that there is a toll, because you're sitting with people and you're asking them about their lives and you're looking into their eyes and they're telling you about horrifying things. And I think people can feel guilty. Well, it's not me who's experiencing that thing. I don't. It's not me. Look at me. I get to go back to my nice life in wherever. So you feel like, well, I can't possibly be affected by that. You don't have the right to be affected by it. And I think I just say to anyone who does that job, you will be affected by that. You can't not. And so recognize that and find ways of kind of offloading that, whether it's, talking therapy or friends or whatever it is, but find ways of just recognizing that there is a toll and impact on to that work. I definitely felt that. And I have to say, I do very little of that kind of work these days, probably only a couple of times a year. I actually go and do content production. But now that I do it in partnership with the people who I'm meeting, it doesn't make hearing the stories I hear any easier. I was in Cox's Bazar last year with UNHCR, and the things people were talking about were amongst the worst I've ever heard. It doesn't make it any easier to hear those things and to then come back to my nice life and whatever. But it did make it better to know that those people were passionate about telling that story, were in control of that story, and that I could. And then I had this kind of ongoing dialogue with them. If that felt somehow better than what had happened in the past, or those two.
How can we'll get on to the last sort of? I've got a couple of rapid fire questions, but before that, you talked about sort of secondary PTSD, this vicarious trauma in the if you're working on content, or not necessarily just content, but this actually could be in various parts of an organization. How can leaders protect their team's sort of well-being, even if that's vicariously in the team or in the UK? Like, what do you have any advice for how they can protect the team?
I think the best way to protect your team is to be explicit and open about the fact that the work that you do will have an emotional toll. And I think just saying that changes the dynamic immediately, especially as a leader, but then also holding space and time for discussion internally is really important. So, in my department, I had a department of 35 people, let's say, when we started having, it wasn't kind of an official once a month time, but every time we worked on a big campaign or we'd done lots of story production, we would get together and just have a moment where we talked about what we'd heard and seen and how we felt, and without booze, importantly, but like over a cup of tea. But we'd have that conversation, and I think just explicitly saying that it's good to talk about this. And some people wouldn't say very much, would just listen, and some people would share things. But just that means that it's then becomes something shared rather than something that you're holding inside yourself and going home and feeling like you can't talk about it. Because the other thing I think for leaders to recognise is that for the people who work in an organisation, if they're not talking to their colleagues, there's very few people they can talk to. I'm sure many people will recognise this, that, a lot of the time, in my life, in my family, in my kind of social life, when people say, "Oh, what have you been doing this week at work?" It's quite hard for me to tell them what I've been doing because it's a real downer often, right? And they can't understand where I've been or what I've seen, whereas the people that I work with can. And so I think making space to have those conversations and creating this shared community of understanding is very important.
Yeah, fantastic. So we've got a couple of rapid fire questions, and then we'll wrap. Jess, you're building a personal charity. It's a Jess charity. You need sort of direction in life from a personal board of trustees. So I'm getting at sort of mentors, influences. Who are the 2 to 3 people that you're putting on your board of personal trustees?
Oh, question. Definitely some of the people that I have worked with in partnership. So the team I'm currently working with in Kenya, who are like a bunch of young people in their 20s who are living as refugees in Kakuma. A couple of them definitely on there because they've got some great advice, and they're really cutting through all the crap to what really matters. One person I would love to put on there, but sadly I lost last year, was my old boss, Tamsin Monda from WaterAid, who was the best boss I've ever had and a really wise woman. And so, in my dream scenario, I would be able to continue to communicate with her.
What made her the best boss you've had?
She was really trusting. So she would push you, but she would always believe in the crazy ideas that you came up with. So she would give you a lot of space. She gave me a lot of space to develop things that I thought might work and to try new methods and ways of working and ideas. And sometimes she would ask me some rather pointed questions about them, but she would always give me a lot of space to do that. I think probably the third person would be, I don't know if you like me describing him as this, but my work dad, who's someone called Hugo Slim, who's works in the humanitarian sector and he now works as an academic at Oxford as well. And I have the great kind of honour, I've got 4 times a year going away with the UN and their senior leadership team for the different regions and running a kind of 4-day workshop about how we influence for change. And I look at the external influencing area. And Hugo is, he does the sort of diplomacy area, and he's a bit of a typical British diplomat. And if you imagine one, it's like cut out, casting central, it's him. But the reason that I would pick him as well is because he is a very good listener and very good at directing ideas. You're asking the right questions to not stifle you, not to tell you to do something different, but just to ask the right questions that help you reframe and rethink the things you're planning on doing. So maybe I'll get a couple of them to be actually on board for me.
Final rapid fire question. So a phone company has come to you and said, Jess, we're going to facilitate you sending a text to every sort of sector storyteller out there. You've got the confines of a text message character limit. What are you saying to globally sort of storytellers in this space that we've talked about?
Storytelling is best done as a team activity, and ensure that part of the decision making is coming from people with lived experience, who actually know about the thing you're trying to talk about. I would wordsmith that to be more snappy.
It's on the edge of character limit. It's close. Jess, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been, I feel like we could have like 10 episodes to get more into this stuff, but is there anything you want to sort of say at this point, thinking about the audience of sort of charity leaders potentially, anything on your mind that we haven't talked about that you want to raise?
I suppose just keep momentum going, like I said, so last week I was doing this UN thing that I was just explaining that I do, and I was in Istanbul with 32 people who run the UN's responses all across the Middle East and Europe, and it felt quite apocalyptic, the talk in the room, based on this kind of shifting of world orders. But the first few days everyone was feeling quite negative, and then everyone started thinking, well, maybe this is actually a moment to pause and think about how we rejig the aid system, how we do something different, how we recognize the shifting of world powers and how we operate within it. And I think so that left me feeling a little nervous, but also quite inspired. And so I think around the storytelling side of things, it's the same. The world is shifting, but we don't have to be afraid and stop changing. I think it's just always keeping that momentum going forward.
Amazing. Jess, thank you so much. Thanks for coming on to Causes.
No worries. Thanks. It was such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.